She saw the message, read every word. When he walked in, she didn't scream, didn't cry. She just asked one question.
Care to explain?
He smirked and said, I cheated. So what? She smiled. That was the second the most feared man in the city realized he hadn't just broken a vow, he'd accidentally declared war on the only person who knows where his bodies are buried. The digital pulse of the city hummed through the transparent skin of the penthouse, casting a rhythmic, electric blue onto the floor. Cairo stood at the center of the vast expanse, his tall frame cutting a sharp, uncompromising line against the sprawling lights of the district. He didn't offer a scripted apology or the frantic stuttering of a man caught in a lie. Instead, he worked the buttons of his heavy, slate-gray wool coat with a mechanical precision, his eyes as flat and lightless as unpolished flint. The black serpent on his neck seemed to coil tighter as his jaw set, a permanent mark of a man who took what he wanted without asking for permission. He expected the predictable fallout. He had built an empire on the shattered nerves of his enemies, and he anticipated the same from the woman who shared his bed. He waited for the glass to break, for the jagged accusations to fly, or for the quiet, hollowed-out sobbing that usually followed his cruelty. He even had a mental tally of the jewelry it would take to buy back the status quo, a transactional fix for a transactional betrayal. Instead, Zarel remained seated, her silhouette draped in a sculptural, bone-white asymmetrical tunic that made her look more like a high priestess than a victim. She didn't smell of flowery perfumes or the lingering salt of tears. She carried the crisp, mineral bite of a wet stone and the faint, dry sting of an old library. Her gaze didn't flicker, it didn't drop. It held his with a clinical, terrifying clarity. "So what?" she echoed, her voice a low-frequency vibration that didn't hold a single tremor. Then, the smile started. It wasn't a mask of hysteria or a tremor of grief. It was a slow, deliberate bloom of amusement that never reached her eyes. It was the expression of a grand master watching a novice walk directly into a trap they hadn't even realized was set. Cairo's smirk didn't just fade, it turned into a rigid, crystalline stillness. The arrogance that usually sat so comfortably on his shoulders suddenly felt like a liability. He had expected to crush her spirit with a single, blunt sentence. But looking at her now, he felt a phantom pressure at the base of his skull. For the first time in a decade, the man who ruled the streets felt like he was standing on a floor that was starting to tilt. He hadn't just disrespected a partner. He had provoked an architect. And as Zarel stood up, her movements fluid and hauntingly calm, Cairo realized that "so what?" was about to become the most expensive question he had ever asked. The silence in the penthouse didn't just linger. It solidified, turning the air into a pressurized chamber where every breath felt like a calculated risk. Cairo didn't move. He stood with his hands buried in the pockets of his matte charcoal wool trousers, his silhouette a jagged interruption against the electric sprawl of the city. He was waiting for the structural failure, the moment Zarel's composure would splinter into the predictable debris of a woman betrayed. He had delivered his admission with the flat, mechanical indifference of a man discarding a spent casing, and now he watched her with a predator's patience, looking for the telltale tremor in her hands. Instead of retreating toward the bedroom to pack, Zarel drifted toward the bar console. She moved with a fluid architectural grace, the heavy, pleated silk of her copper-toned wrap catching the dim light like a slow-burning fuse. She didn't carry the floral traces of a grieving lover. She trailed the sharp, resinous snap of a crushed juniper berry and the dry, mineral bite of rain-washed slate. The clink of the heavy crystal stopper was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, metallic punctuation to the tension. She poured a measure of the dark, peat-heavy liquid, the amber swirl catching the recessed lighting as she stirred it with a silver pick. Her hands were steady, impossibly so. As she walked back toward him, she didn't look like a casualty of his ego. She looked like a woman who had just found the final, damning piece of a very lucrative puzzle. Cairo's thumb traced the ink of the serpent on his jawline, his pulse a frantic, invisible drumming beneath the skin of his throat. He wasn't afraid. Fear was a sensation he had long ago cauterized, but he was profoundly suspicious. The arrogance that usually served as his primary weapon began to feel like a liability. He watched her approach, his eyes narrowing as he scanned for the fracture in her mask. "You look tense, Cairo," she murmured, her voice a low, steady friction that felt like a blade across fine-grain leather. She held the glass out to him, her fingers never once losing their grip. "And a man with your enemies can't afford to be clumsy. Disrespect is a luxury. Sloppiness is a death sentence." She didn't wait for him to take the drink. She set it on the granite side table with a deliberate, haunting click. Her smile remained, a slow, knowing curve that made the vast, expensive space feel suddenly very small for a man of his stature. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her gaze locking onto his with a clarity that made the room tilt. "Why would I leave? Everything in this house, including the silence you're so afraid of right now, belongs to me." She turned away, leaving the drink untouched, and the man who thought he ruled her, standing in the center of a transparent empire that was no longer his to command. The following morning, the penthouse didn't wake to the sound of an apology. It woke to the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of a silent reconstruction. Cairo emerged from the primary suite, his frame draped in a heavy, ink indigo linen shirt that was left unbuttoned at the throat, revealing the serpent's head resting just below his ear. He expected to find the remnants of a crisis, a half-empty closet, or the salt-stained face of a woman who had spent the night mourning a ghost. Instead, he found Zarel seated at the expansive marble slab of the kitchen island, her silhouette framed by the blinding, surgical light of the district. She was dressed in a structured, bone-white wool vest with exaggerated architectural shoulders, her arms bare and gleaming like dark mahogany. She didn't look up when he entered. She didn't acknowledge the heavy, rhythmic thud of his footsteps. She was focused on a series of translucent tablets, her fingers dancing across the glass with a terrifying, clinical precision. The air in the room didn't hold the domestic warmth of breakfast. It carried the sharp, citrus and clove bite of a pomelo peel being crushed, and the dry, metallic chill of a cooling server room. "You're up early," Cairo noted, his voice a dry, grating friction that attempted to reclaim the room's gravity. He leaned against the counter, his presence a dark, suffocating weight. But Zarel didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "Time is the only asset we can't hedge, Cairo," she murmured, her voice a low-frequency hum that felt entirely detached from him. She tapped a final command on the screen, and a series of encrypted notifications chirped in a rapid electronic sequence. Cairo's eyes narrowed as he caught a glimpse of the ledger. "That's a significant withdrawal from the Cayman holding. What are we buying?" Zarel finally looked at him, her gaze meeting his with a neutrality so profound it was more insulting than a slap. "Not we, Cairo. I. And I'm not buying anything you can put in a warehouse. I'm diversifying my peace of mind." She stood up, the heavy pleats of her vest swaying with a rhythmic, weighted grace. She didn't reach for him. She didn't look for the validation he usually demanded. She moved through the space with a chilling, newfound autonomy, as if he were merely a piece of furniture she had grown accustomed to navigating. "The Nam Syndicate called," she added, her tone as flat and professional as a news anchor's. "I told them you were unavailable. You're too reactive today to negotiate a margin. You'd burn the deal just to prove you're still the son." She walked past him, her shoulder grazing his chest with a touch so fleeting it felt like an accidental collision with a stranger. She didn't go to him. She went toward the elevator, her movements fluid and hauntingly final. Cairo stood alone, his thumb tracing the ink on his jawline, realizing with a sudden, icy clarity that he hadn't just lost her loyalty, he had lost his invisibility. He was still the boss, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was being watched by someone who wasn't impressed. Cairo decided to test the structural integrity of Zarel's new, clinical silence. He didn't do it with a shout. He did it with an intrusion. By mid-afternoon, the penthouse was no longer a sanctuary of muted tones and curated shadows. It was a chaotic theater of his external life. Two of his most volatile lieutenants stood by the expansive glass, their voices a jagged, rhythmic percussion as they debated a shipment of intercepted microchips. The air, usually crisp with Zarel's preferred scent of crushed vetiver and cold, rain-washed stone, was now choked with the heavy, scorched metal smell of solder and the bitter, oily film of high-octane fuel clinging to their leather jackets. Cairo sat at the head of the obsidian dining table, his frame draped in a structured, midnight teal velvet blazer that caught the light like deep-sea bioluminescence. He watched Zarel with a predatory intensity, waiting for her to snap at the disrespect of bringing the syndicate's grit onto her polished floors. He wanted her to scream, to demand they leave, to provide him with the familiar friction of a woman territory marking her home. Instead, Zarel entered the room with the detached grace of a visiting consultant. She was dressed in a column-like midi dress of matte, bone-gray wool, its sharp architectural seams giving her the appearance of a marble bust come to life. She didn't offer a greeting, nor did she acknowledge the intruders with so much as a flicker of annoyance. She walked to the marble island, her movements fluid and entirely unhurried, and began to review a digital manifest on her tablet. "The noise is a bit much, isn't it?" Cairo prompted, his voice a dry, grating friction that cut through the lieutenant's chatter. He leaned back, his thumb tracing the serpent's head on his jaw, his eyes locked onto hers. "I thought you preferred the quiet for your diversifications." Zarel didn't look up. She adjusted the tablet's orientation with a steady hand, her voice a low-frequency hum that remained terrifyingly neutral. "The volume is irrelevant, Cairo. Data doesn't have an ear. If you feel the need to conduct business in the dining room, I assume it's because your office has become compromised. Should I call the sweep team, or are you just feeling particularly loud today?" The lieutenants went silent, the tension in the room suddenly pivoting from the shipment to the woman who had just treated the most feared man in the city like an inefficient manager. Cairo's smirk didn't falter, but his grip on his glass tightened until his knuckles turned a bloodless white. "I'm not feeling anything," he rasped, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Good," Zarel murmured, finally meeting his gaze with a gaze so clinical it felt like a biopsy. "Emotion is a margin killer. By the way, I've rebalanced the logistics for the Busan port. You were overpaying for security that didn't exist." She turned and drifted back toward the hallway, her presence leaving behind a void that was heavier than the noise she had ignored. Cairo watched her disappear, realizing that by bringing his world into hers, he hadn't asserted dominance. He had simply given her more territory to master. He was no longer a husband being forgiven. He was a liability being managed. The alarm didn't blare. It pulsed, a rhythmic crimson heartbeat on the command console in Cairo's private study. By 3 a.m, the report was a jagged digital scar. Warehouse 7 had been breached. Not a scorched earth raid, but a surgical extraction of high-yield narcotics and encrypted hardware. Cairo stood over the monitors, his frame draped in a heavy charcoal-knit robe with a high architectural collar that obscured the black serpent on his jaw. The air in the room didn't smell of wood smoke or desperation. It carried the sharp ozone metallic tang of a short-circuiting wire and the dry, alkaline dust of disturbed concrete. He looked at the footage, shadows moving with a familiarity that made his pulse a rapid, invisible drumming against his ribs. This wasn't a rival's blunt force. It was an inside bypass. Someone had the rotating ciphers. Someone had walked through the biometric gates like they owned the ghost in the machine. "I have 3 lieutenants who would lose their tongues before they sold a single sequence," Cairo rasped, his voice a dry, grating friction directed at the doorway. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He could feel the clinical, cooling presence of Zarel as she stepped into the room. She was dressed in a fluid, floor-length gown of matte slate silk, the fabric absorbing the red emergency lights until she looked like a shadow carved from stone. She didn't offer a platitude or a gasp of shock. She carried the bitter, resinous scent of a crushed bay leaf and the cold, sterile aura of a clean room. "Then your lieutenants are loyal, Cairo, but they are predictable," Zarel murmured, her voice a low-frequency hum that remained terrifyingly steady. She walked to the console, her fingers, long, dark, and steady, hovering over the glass. "You're looking for a traitor. You should be looking for a lapse in logic." Cairo's hand clamped onto the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning a bloodless white. "You changed the logistics protocols yesterday. You moved the encryption keys to a private server. No one has the access but you." He finally turned, his gaze a predatory, unblinking stare. "So what, Zarel? Is this the price of your silence? You're bleeding my inventory to prove a point?" Zarel didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She met his accusations with a gaze so neutral, it felt like a biopsy of his fading authority. "If I wanted to destroy you, Cairo, I wouldn't steal a few crates. I would simply stop managing your chaos." She tapped a command, and the monitor shifted to a secondary feed, a localized jammer tucked behind a support beam. "The leak isn't a person. It's a habit. You've been using the same courier for 3 years because he was reliable. I let the hit happen so you could see how easily your loyalty can be bypassed by a higher bidder." She leaned in, her face inches from his, her smile a slow, knowing curve that made the vast, expensive room feel like a cage. "I didn't break the seal. I just stopped fixing the cracks you ignored while you were busy elsewhere. Now, do you want to find your inventory? Or do you want to keep pretending you're the only one who knows how to play this game?" The grand ballroom of the Lotte World Tower didn't just glitter, it vibrated with the low-frequency hum of 1,000 expensive secrets. The air was a suffocating blend of bitter almond, the sharp ozone of industrial aircon, and the dry metallic edge of new currency. Cairo moved through the crowd like a predator in his own territory, his frame draped in a structured, double-breasted suit of deep indigo velvet that looked almost black under the shifting spotlights. The serpent on his jawline was a dark, unblinking sentinel, matching the restless intensity in his eyes as he searched for the one person he no longer understood. He found her at the center of a circle that included the city's most dangerous shipping magnates, men who usually only spoke to Cairo through intermediaries or gunfire. Zarel didn't look like a wife seeking refuge. She looked like a sovereign taking a census. She was encased in a sculptural gown of matte charcoal liquid metal, the fabric clinging to her frame like a second skin of molten lead. It didn't shimmer, it absorbed the light, making her dark skin glow with a terrifying, radiant clarity. Cairo's pulse drummed a rhythmic, invisible warning against his ribs. He watched as she leaned in toward Park, his most aggressive rival in the Busan ports, her hand resting lightly on a clutch carved from a single block of translucent, smoky obsidian. She wasn't pleading or flirting. She was reciting data. "The margin on the Jeju route isn't a logistics error, Mr. Park." Zarel's voice carried over the ambient noise, a cool, melodic friction that made Cairo's jaw lock. It's a deliberate leak. If you're interested in the patch, I suggest you stop looking at the ships and start looking at the manifests. Cairo stepped into the circle, his presence a heavy, suffocating shadow. "Zarel," he rasped, his voice a dry, grating warning. "I didn't realize you were providing consultancy services to our associates tonight." Zarel didn't startle. She didn't even turn her head fully to acknowledge him. She simply offered Park a slow, knowing smile, the kind that promised everything while giving away nothing. "Business is a fluid asset, Cairo. It doesn't respect a vow any more than a man does." She finally looked at him, her gaze clinical and entirely devoid of the warmth he had spent years taking for granted. "Mr. Park was just explaining the difficulty of his current encryption. I was simply suggesting that loyalty is only expensive when it's poorly managed." The silence that followed was a physical weight. Park looked between the two, his eyes widening as he realized the power in the Shin Syndicate wasn't sitting in the indigo suit. It was standing in the charcoal metal. Cairo reached for her arm, his fingers hovering just an inch from her skin. But Zarel pivoted with a fluid, haunting grace. She didn't recoil. She simply exited his orbit, leaving him standing in the center of a room that was suddenly whispering his name for all the wrong reasons. The most feared man in the underworld realized, with a sickening jolt, that his wife hadn't just joined the party. She had started the auction. The atmosphere within the Shin Syndicate's inner sanctum had transitioned from a den of wolves to a silent, high-stakes boardroom. Cairo sat at the head of the obsidian table, his frame draped in a structured, high-collared tunic of raw, unbleached silk in a shade of oxidized bone. It was a garment that usually signaled absolute authority, yet today it felt like a ceremonial shroud. His thumb traced the jagged ink of the serpent on his jawline, his eyes tracking the subtle, rhythmic shift of his men. They weren't looking at him for the final command. They were watching the doorway. Zarel entered with a clinical, haunting precision. She wasn't wearing the soft, yielding fabrics of a domestic companion. She was encased in a sharp, architectural blazer of charcoal-stained leather with exaggerated, razor-cut lapels, paired with slim tapered trousers in a matte, oil-slick black. She didn't carry the scent of a floral apology. She trailed the cold, metallic snap of a freshly opened safe and the bitter, dry sting of a double-shot espresso. "The shipment from Busan is stalled," Jax, Cairo's most aggressive enforcer, stated. He didn't turn to Cairo. His gaze was anchored on Zarel as she drifted to the far end of the table. "Customs flagged the manifests. We have 3 hours before the Port Authority moves in." Cairo leaned forward, his voice a dry, grating friction that attempted to reclaim the room's gravity. "I've already ordered the secondary route. We burn the manifests and move the crates to the warehouse." The silence that followed was a physical weight. Jax didn't nod. He didn't move to execute the order. Instead, he waited, his eyes flicking to Zarel for the silent confirmation that Cairo's blunt force solution was the correct one. Zarel didn't look at Cairo. She tapped a command on her tablet, the screen casting a pale electric glow against her teak-toned skin. Burning the manifests is a margin killer, Jax. It leaves a digital footprint that leads directly to our holding company. Her voice was a low-frequency hum, devoid of any emotional tremor. I've already rerouted the digital signatures through a shell in Singapore. Tell the port authority the cargo is a medical supplies surplus. They won't open the crates because I've prepaid the inspection fees through their own private accounts. Jax nodded once, a sharp, mechanical gesture of respect, and signaled the other men to leave. They moved with a newfound, terrifying efficiency, ignoring Cairo as if he were a legacy piece of furniture. Cairo's knuckles turned a bloodless white against the obsidian table. He was still the man who pulled the trigger, but he realized with a sickening clarity that he was no longer the one who chose the target. Zarel had transitioned from the wife he could disrespect into the consultant he couldn't survive. She stood up, her movements fluid and entirely autonomous, and looked at him with a gaze so neutral it felt like a biopsy. You're still thinking like a street boss, Cairo, she whispered, her smile a slow, knowing curve. But I'm building an empire that doesn't need a loud voice to stay standing. The heavy, rhythmic thud of Cairo's boots against the white marble was the only warning before the study door was thrown back against the wall. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a cornered animal, his asymmetrical tunic of raw, bone-white silk stained with the dark, jagged sweat of a man losing his grip. The serpent on his jawline seemed to pulse with a life of its own as he loomed over the desk, his presence a suffocating, atmospheric pressure that made the air turn sharp and metallic. Zarel didn't flinch. She was draped in a sculptural, high-collared vest of deep, oxidized bronze, the fabric stiff and unyielding against her teak-toned skin. She didn't carry the scent of a floral apology. She trailed the cold, clinical snap of a freshly opened vault and the bitter, dry sting of a cooling espresso. Enough, Cairo rasped, his voice a dry, grating friction that tore through the silence. He slammed his palms onto the desk, his knuckles turning a bloodless white. You've played your games. You've undermined my lieutenants and redirected my margins. But this is still my house, and that is still my name on the gate. You either submit to the arrangement we had, or you get out. Now. Zarel finally looked up from the holographic display, her gaze meeting his with a neutrality so profound it felt like a biopsy. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She offered a slow, deliberate smile, the kind that didn't belong to a victim, but to a liquidator. The arrangement, Cairo? She whispered, her voice a low-frequency hum that didn't hold a single tremor. You mean the one where you buy silence with offshore accounts? The one where you think a mistress is an expense I haven't already audited? Cairo's eyes narrowed, his breath hitching in a way he couldn't mask. What are you talking about? The villa in Jeju, the trust in Zurich, the Consultancy fees you've been funneling to keep her quiet? Zarel murmured, her fingers dancing across the glass with a terrifying, mechanical precision. She turned the screen toward him. I didn't just find them, Cairo. I liquidated them. 4 hours ago, the accounts were closed, the deeds were transferred to a holding company I control, and your entertainment was served with an eviction notice. The arrogance that had sustained Cairo for a decade didn't just fade, it evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, crystalline stillness. He looked at the screen, at the zeroed-out balances, and realized the floor beneath him wasn't just tilting. It was gone. You can't do that, he breathed, the words tasting like ash. I didn't do it because I was hurt, Cairo, Zarel said, standing up with a fluid, haunting grace. She adjusted the bronze collar of her vest, her touch cold and final. I did it because you were being sloppy. You used syndicate assets for a personal deficit. I simply corrected the math. Now, you can keep shouting about who owns this house, or you can realize that the only person keeping your creditors from the door is currently sitting in your chair. The crisis didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived as a flickering dead zone on the satellite feed. By midnight, the Shin Syndicate's primary distribution artery at the Incheon docks had been cauterized by a joint federal task force. It was a surgical strike, timed with a precision that suggested a leak deeper than any lieutenant. Cairo stood in the center of the war room, his structured midnight navy tunic of raw silk unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the serpent on his jawline, pulsing with a frantic, rhythmic heat. The air in the room was thick, carrying the acrid, ozone-heavy scent of overheating hardware and the bitter, metallic dry rub of a gun oil rag. His remaining captains stood in a semicircle, their faces carved from the same gray granite as the walls. They weren't looking at the tactical maps. They were looking at the empty chair at the head of the table. The seized assets include the hardware for the NAM contract, Jax rasped, his voice a dry, grating friction. If we don't clear those containers by dawn, the syndicate isn't just broke. We're a target for every rival from here to Taipei. Cairo, we need the override codes for the automated cranes, or we start shooting our way out. Cairo's grip tightened on the edge of the obsidian table until the stones seemed ready to splinter. I gave the order to the tech team an hour ago. Why aren't the gates moving? Because the tech team doesn't answer to you anymore. A voice murmured from the shadows. Zarel stepped into the light, draped in a sculptural, floor-length coat of charcoal-pressed wool with high architectural lapels. She didn't carry the floral traces of a wife seeking reconciliation. She moved in a cloud of sharp, resinous juniper and the cold, sterile snap of a mountain frost. She held a single, slim device in her hand, the only bridge left between the Shin Empire and total liquidation. Cairo's eyes narrowed into predatory slits. You're holding the syndicate hostage for a domestic grudge? That's a suicide mission, Zarel. It's not a grudge, Cairo. It's an audit, she said, her voice a low-frequency hum that settled into the bones of every man in the room. She didn't look at the captains. She looked directly at the man who had thought he could discard her. The codes are partitioned. I've moved the digital keys to a private cloud you can't reach. You can try to force the gates, lose half your men, and watch the Shin name evaporate by sunrise. Or you can acknowledge the reality of the new board. The silence was a physical weight, a choice between a dying ego and a surviving kingdom. Cairo looked at his men, then at the woman who had transformed his betrayal into her leverage. He realized with a sickening, crystalline clarity that the keys weren't just in her hand, they were her. He took a slow, jagged breath, his pride tasting like rusted iron. What is the price, Sorel? Total transparency, she whispered, her smile a slow, haunting curve. And from tonight, I don't just manage the math, I dictate the move. The transition didn't happen with a signature or a public ceremony. It occurred in the heavy, pressurized silence of the penthouse as the sun began to bleed a bruised purple over the city's jagged horizon. The glass house had ceased to be a home of shared domesticity and had fully evolved into a high-functioning command center. Cairo stood by the panoramic window, his frame draped in a heavy, unstructured overcoat of charcoal-brushed wool, the fabric absorbing the dim light rather than reflecting it. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck, only to realize the island he'd reached was owned by the person who had sunk his boat. The serpent on his jawline remained a dark, rhythmic pulse against his skin, but the predatory tension that had once defined his stance had been replaced by a rigid, watchful stillness. He wasn't looking at the city anymore. He was looking at the reflection of the woman seated at the obsidian table behind him. Sorel was encased in a sculptural, high-collared tunic of iridescent raven silk, the fabric shifting between ink black and a deep metallic green as she moved. She didn't carry the floral traces of a wife who had been won back. She moved in a cloud of sharp, resinous cedar wood and the cold, ozone-heavy scent of a cooling server. Her fingers moved across the glass of her tablet with a terrifying mechanical precision, finalizing the restructuring of the Shin Syndicate's offshore holdings. She wasn't just managing his money anymore. She had mapped his entire existence into a series of encrypted nodes that only she could activate. The Nam contract is secure, Sorel murmured, her voice a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the quiet room. The Port Authority has been credited, and the manifests have been scrubbed. You're officially a legitimate logistics consultant for the next fiscal quarter, Cairo. It's a boring title, but it's one that doesn't come with a federal indictment. Cairo turned slowly, his boots making a dull, rhythmic thud against the marble. He looked at the woman who had replaced his hubris with her own architecture. You've liquidated my mistresses, hijacked my lieutenants, and turned my private accounts into your personal ledger. I should have killed you the night I walked in here. Sorel didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from the screen. You could have, she agreed, her tone as flat and professional as a clinical report. But you're a businessman, Cairo, and you realized, perhaps too late, that I am the only asset you own that isn't currently depreciating. You don't want a corpse. You want a kingdom. And I'm the only one who knows how to keep the crown from slipping. She finally looked up, her gaze meeting his with a neutrality so profound it felt like a biopsy of his remaining ego. There was no hatred in her eyes, no lingering spark of the woman who had once waited for him to come home. That version of Zarel had been burned away, replaced by a strategist who viewed his betrayal not as a heartbreak, but as a tactical opening. "I'm not leaving you, Cairo," she whispered, a slow, knowing curve touching her lips. "Why would I? You've spent 10 years building a throne, and I've spent 3 weeks making sure I'm the only one who can sit on it. You're the face of the Shin Syndicate. You're the muscle and the reputation. But I am the infrastructure." Cairo walked toward her, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight. But as he reached the edge of the table, he didn't reach for her throat or her hand. He reached for the glass she had poured, the same dark, peat-heavy liquid she had offered him the night of the confrontation. He took a slow, jagged swallow, the amber liquid tasting like smoke and rusted iron. "I thought I was the one who decided the price of loyalty," he rasped, his voice a dry, grating friction. "Loyalty is a variable, Cairo. Control is a constant," Zarel said, standing up with a fluid, haunting grace. She adjusted the architectural collar of her tunic, her touch cold and final. "You wanted to know, so what about your choices? This is the so what. You still have your name, you still have your street. But from tonight, every breath you take is an expense I've already pre-authorized." She walked past him, her shoulder grazing his chest with a touch so fleeting it felt like a ghost passing through a ruin. She didn't head for the bedroom. She headed for the study, the door closing with a deliberate, haunting click. Cairo stood alone in the center of his glass empire, realizing that she hadn't just survived his betrayal. She had absorbed him. He was no longer the master of the house. He was the most expensive piece of furniture in a room he no longer owned.